Without the act of doing, you couldn't have created this sacred space that you love and value so much. However, you can't fully appreciate the sacred space if you can't inhabit it through a state of being. Hi everyone, my name is James Feeney. Welcome to or back to my channel. Today I thought I might explore a topic that I find myself thinking about and reflecting on quite often. And so using this video as a medium to express those thoughts and perhaps condense them in a way that's a little bit more coherent would be helpful for myself and anybody out there who is also interested in these subjects. It's more of a duality, a universal, abstract concept than it is anything inherently spiritual, although I want to frame it through the lens of spirituality and spiritual practice. I use the word spiritual quite liberally in my videos, mostly because I find it to be a helpful umbrella term, considering we as a community tend to share a lot in common in terms of interests and hobbies and things that we're interested in, but we don't all stem from the same cultural background, we don't all have the same belief systems, and so spiritual to me can encompass witches and magical practitioners just as easily as it can somebody who is very devout in a structured religious path. So I think it covers the ballpark, but the subject matter I really want to touch upon is the idea or the duality of doing versus being. I think that there's a lot to unpack there, and I'm definitely not going to even scratch the surface. So feel free to chime in with your personal insights in the comments below. I also know that what I'm saying here is not anything groundbreaking or revolutionary, but if it helps to inspire or at least helps you to recall and think a little bit differently about this subject matter, all the better. And I do think that awareness and self-awareness where these subjects are concerned is only beneficial to us in our daily lives. That element of self-awareness helping us to lead lives that are hopefully more connected and happy based on principles and ideas that we actually care about. So I also have this book of poetry, A Casting of Light. It's more of an occult or spiritual, meditative poetry book. And there are some poems in here that I think illustrate in a very profound way the concepts that I want to touch upon. So doing versus being, these things seem, I would say at times, a little bit obvious. You know, you do something or you are. However, I think that there's a depth to these tenets. I almost want to call them tenets. I do think that culturally speaking, there are certain cultures and backgrounds and belief systems that lend themselves really well to the ideas of doing, and then there are others that lend themselves really well to the idea of being. Doing, I think, is the act of being active, of creating. It's more of a mindset than anything. So in defining what doing is, I'm making this video. I am in an active mindset right now through doing. Even when I relax or take time for myself, that's something that I'm still doing depending on how I am conceptualizing it. If this is something that, if I say that I am relaxing, that is the act of doing the relaxation. So it's less about the thing that is happening and it's more about how you're thinking or going about it, versus being, which is more of a neutral or receptive state where one simply is. There's less concern about what is happening, what needs to be done. There's not as much of this active role where you're partaking in the world around you. It's more of a mindset and state where one is existing. So it's, in my opinion, a lot more receptive or neutral, whereas the act of doing or being in a state of doing is active. You are participating in the world. And I don't think, just to disclaim, I don't think either is better or worse. I don't think there's a right way. And I actually think we probably need a balance of both. Otherwise, either nothing would happen if we were never in a state of doing, and if we ignore the state of being, we are leaving out an entire sect or sector of existence that is really valuable. I will say in Western society, in modern society, specifically the Western world and the United States at large, it seems to me, and of course this is a generalization, that doing is the ultimate. We frame our entire cultural, economic, socioeconomic state on the idea of perpetuating the doing and ignoring and castigating and belittling the way of life that comes along with being. We relegate that to a corner, and when we approach it, I don't even think it's genuine, and we will sometimes try to wrap up services and just cultural norms as being, when in actuality they are more in the camp of doing. I think it's very capitalist in that, or at least capitalism fosters a state of doing versus a state of being, because you can exploit and profit off of and make productive and efficient the act of doing. Being, you can't exactly profit off of in the same way. You can't exploit it. You can't consider it to be very efficient in the way. It just doesn't lend itself to the same types of core values that you get with the idea of doing. So all that being said, I do think that most of us unconsciously are a lot of the time in a state of doing. Perhaps you come from a different culture or a different area of the world, or you have a very different walk of life than a lot of us. And I would love to hear for those of you who come from backgrounds, whether it's a religious background, a cultural background, where do or being, I would say, is emphasized. I tend to see that more in Eastern cultures and religions rather than the Western world, which seems to foster, facilitate, indoctrinate us into the state of doing. So in casting of light, I guess we'll start with a poem, or I have a handful of poems. This poem is called Soul Motion, and I think it encapsulates the idea of doing, or being in a state of doing versus being. Soul Motion. Every soul is immortal, for that which is perpetually moved is eternal. But that which moves another and is moved by another, when it has a cessation of motion, has also a cessation of life. Hence, that alone which moves itself, because it does not desert itself, never ceases to be moved, but also in the fountain and principle of motion to other things which are moved. But a principle is unbegotten, for everything which is generated is necessarily generated from a principle, while the principle itself is incapable of being generated. So in there, in a sort of abstract or read between the lines sort of way, I think we're getting this more spiritualized way of perceiving doing. I don't think that being in a state of doing is detached from spirituality. I think that creation is the act of doing. You have to be in the doing state of things in order for things to be created. Things like life, for example, are created through the doing state of being. Doing state of being, and then we've got being, the doing state. Creation comes from that, life comes from that. Not much would happen in the world without the state of doing. We need the active aspect or point of extremism on the spectrum between, or the duality of doing versus being. And so the soul needs to move, it needs to progress. We need to learn. Creation needs to happen for us to exist, for us to bring other things into existence. It's a beautiful process. And so I think that this poem highlights that perfectly in the positive aspect, because I know I'm being a bit critical of doing, but it's only because it comes so naturally to us, and because it's essentially the extremes end of the spectrum that we tend to inhabit, yet we don't acknowledge that we're inhabiting it. And we think that through taking time for ourselves, scheduling in, or giving ourselves times to relax, that we are in this state of being where we are ourselves. But that's not the case. Most of our lives, when we are taking that time to relax, to slow down, we're still in the state of doing. We've decided that that is an action, and we're raised with that just being the norm. And it's very difficult if you're brought up surrounded by in an environment that is only just the doing, that you don't really know how to be. And I think that the state of being is a little bit more truly relaxing. However, it can be hard to attain, and it can feel unnatural and uncomfortable for those of us who don't inhabit that space often or voluntarily enough. Now I'll pick a poem that I think encapsulates the idea of being Instead, let's see, which one did I pick that I wanted to... Okay, I like this one. This one's called Seeing and Hearing. The world is neither in want of eyes extended to things out of itself, nor of ears to receive information externally, but it is itself both eye and that which is visible, ear and that which is audible. Knows all sensible natures, for whence also is the one sense in us, which is prior to many senses derived, except from the universe. The world therefore knows all the beauty that is in itself. Through sight and through hearing, all the harmony which pervades through wholes, hence it neither requires eyes in order to see, nor ears in order to hear. So this is a more, again, abstract or conceptual way of thinking about being, the idea of it being a receptive state where one is either neutral or receiving. That tends to happen through, our senses. We are intaking external stimuli and, I guess, perceiving it through. I think the act of perception is active. However, if we are in a state of being, that perception is different. It's almost like an altered state of consciousness. And the idea that perceiving doesn't necessarily need to happen, that it just is really what I'm getting from this poem. The universe doesn't need eyes to see, it doesn't need ears to hear, it simply is. Through its existence, it is perceiving rather than needing something to do the act of perceiving. Me saying that I see something, I'm in a doing mindset. To have seen it, but not necessarily decided that that was something I was going to do or partake in, is more of the state of being. And to be a part of a whole is to be, versus partaking in the whole is to do. Does that make sense? I know that sounds a little bit weird, but I do think that it's harder, even for myself, who wants to explore these concepts, to categorize and properly define the state of being. It's a little bit more evasive and elusive, especially for those of us who are not used to it, myself included. The vocabulary that we have, especially in the English language, does not lend itself very well to the state of doing. It almost is like words fight us when we want to speak about or investigate the area of being, because it's the antithesis to what we are brought up to be a part of. We're meant to be workers and parts of a machine, to be able to further, to progress, to create, to contribute through doing, and they don't want us to, this is sort of general atmosphere that we actually have created. We created the doing through the doing, and it's a self-perpetuating cycle. Being is a little bit harder to foster and to cradle. It's almost very fragile and very valuable, but I do think it can be run over and ignored, and it has a lot of worth. And to ignore an entire end of a spectrum of existence is such a sad thing. And so that's why I'm here talking about it. So if you are all getting a little bit inspired or just thinking about this, I have videos actually on receptive magic, which I think is, through a more magical scope and paradigm, the act of being or partaking in spirituality through being. That's also something I think that we feel guilty about when we aren't doing enough, even when we don't have enough time to do the things we want, we feel discouraged. Oh, I'm wasting my time. Oh, what am I doing? I'm not doing enough in this capacity. Oh, X, Y, and Z. I'd love to spend more time on my spirituality, but this and that, or I'm lazy. It's all this sort of guilt of not being as invested as we can be in the doing. And I don't think that we should feel guilty. I do think it's more of an instinctual, societally pre-programmed way of feeling. It's our reaction to not being fully vested in doing. Once we find that we're accidentally a little bit in the camp of being, there's this guilt, there's this sort of wall that goes up, and we are unconsciously trained to resist it and to find ourselves and kind of run ourselves back to the end of the doing spectrum. Things like just creating sacred space, for example, yes, you've created it. That was in the camp of doing, but existing in that sacred space that you've created is being. And I find that to be an extremely spiritual act, quite transcendent at times, and a perfect example of that, the fact that we need to have both to live these very fulfilled lives. You know, without the act of doing, you couldn't have created this sacred space that you love and value so much. However, you can't fully appreciate the sacred space if you can't inhabit it through a state of being. And so I value that so much. For example, in my room and my altar space, all those things that I've created through doing, I will never feel fully fulfilled by unless I can be in them, with them, and just around them. I have the sort of repayment I get, the fulfillment I get from the doing is through being. And so both need to walk hand in hand in life. And if you find that maybe you're not as fulfilled in a career, a job, a this, a that in your life, consider how much you are doing and how little you are being. You know, it's like you're not reaping the benefits of the doing if you're not being. And it's hard to be, and you have to actually, at least the way that we tend to go through life, you're not going to just accidentally wind up in a state of being. And if you do, you won't stay there very long because you'll unconsciously get yourself back over to the end of doing. So yeah, just my 2 cents on that. And it's something that I am trying to be a lot more mindful of and aware of, so that way I can optimize, oh my God, a horrible word, a word that is very chronically and insidiously vested in the idea of doing, but I want to be happy. I want to feel fulfilled. And I find that when I am able to balance the amount of doing I have in my life with the amount of being in my life, I feel a lot happier. I feel more fulfilled. And I'm really trying to deprogram the guilt that I feel when it comes to being. I should not feel guilty for being. Nothing is wrong with you for being, and you're never wrong to be. The idea of us all being equal and having every right to existence is, you know, the idea that being is valid. I do think that when we really break it down, you could even argue or speculate that through doing, we perpetuate a lot of these harmful systems. Obviously, things like capitalism and advancement and progress and all those things that we find how we are just, you know, basically sucking up and running and our earth dry is through this very toxic state of only doing and not being. But then when we think of rights and values for people and how we can understand each other, empathize, and create some sense of peace, doing is not very conducive, and it doesn't work in a sort of symbiosis with peace. Being, I think, is very conducive for peace and understanding and valuing ourselves and others. When we know who we are through being, I think you can value another person at a deeper level. I do have, I think, 1 or 2 more poems, and then I'll wrap this up. There wasn't really a point to this video as much as it was just a think tank and amusing. However, I like sharing these ideas on here, and I like to think that I have a community that also enjoys the same types of ideas and that we're all in this together. So what do I have here? Let's go back to another doing poem if I can find one. Okay, Moving Beings. This is what this one is called. Moving Beings. Of all beings, it is necessary that some should move only, but that others should be moved only. And the natures situated between these should both move and be moved. And that with respect to these last, it is necessary either that they should move others, being themselves moved by others, or that they should be self-motive. And I think that that is a little bit cheeky, at least to me, when I try to unravel it, the idea of this using the word move in such a receptive and active and participatory way of just imagining how one exists through a constant state of moving and being moved. And the motive is just, it encapsulates the idea of doing to me perfectly, and in a really fun and interesting light, in that, you know, you can be moved by others, feeling as though, you know, maybe you're being or you're on the receptive end. However, it's still an active state, which would fall into the category of doing versus being, and, you know, this idea of just a sort of cyclical nature of doing. Likewise, I have one more being poem, Learning to See. I guess the idea of seeing and hearing is something I've also found very interesting through the concept of being, because seeing and hearing as perceptive actions, or perceptive actions makes it sound like doing, perceptive organs are inherently active through doing. However, I do think that the concept of seeing and hearing is very much ingratiated into the realm of being. So, learning to see. Since there is no portion of matter which may not be the subject of experiments without end, let us betake ourselves to the regions of mind, where all things are bounded in intellectual measure, where everything is permanent and beautiful, eternal and divine. Let us quit the study of particulars and comprehensive, and, through this, learn to see and recognize whatever exists. So the other form, the other type of seeing, which is a lot less physical, a lot less tangible, and it is a lot more conceptual, and it's that form of seeing, the kind of seeing that we get with the idea of a third eye, or non-literal sight, is the type of seeing that I associate with being. It's more of that literal sight, and I think the idea of anything being super particular and literal makes it fall a little bit more into the camp of doing. Abstract concepts, non-concrete, incorporeal type things to me tend to fall a little bit more into the camp of being. However, like I said, it's a spectrum, and most of us exist in that gray zone, but I do think that a lot of us are more, we tend to live a lot of our lives in the doing zone with a lot of neglect and absence from the being. So that's my 2 cents on that. Let me know what you all think. Let me know how you are all doing and how being you is at this current moment or juncture. I hope you are all well. Like and subscribe if this was fun or interesting. And until next time, bye.